The air in the library was thick with the scent of old leather and expensive perfume, a fragrance of secrets kept for generations. Through the heavy velvet curtains, a sliver of moonlight cut across the floor, illuminating a tangled scene of desperate passion on the rich Persian rug. Her breath came in sharp, broken gasps, a sound that was half pleasure, half protest, lost against the fabric of his simple, dark uniform. "Liam, oh God," she whispered, her voice trembling, her fingers digging into the strong muscles of his shoulders. "We can't. We absolutely can't. Someone will hear." His response was not in words, but in the steady pressure of his lips against her neck, a silent answer that dismissed all her fears. His own voice was a low, rough murmur against her ear, a sound that seemed to vibrate through her entire body. "Shh. Just for a moment, Eleanor. Just feel this. Only this." And she did. For a fleeting, terrifying moment, she allowed herself to feel, to surrender to the raw, forbidden heat that had been simmering beneath the cold, polished surface of her life for months. The quiet, desperate sounds they made were swallowed by the immense, silent house, becoming just another whisper in its long, storied history. But this inferno, burning so recklessly on the library floor, did not ignite in a single flash. It was a slow burn, fanned by lonely nights and unspoken words, in a house that was more a museum than a home. She was Eleanor Vance, the luminous wife of Senator Marcus Vance. To the world, she was an image of flawless grace, a perfect hostess with a smile that could charm dynasties and secure donations. She lived a life curated for the public eye, every dress, every word, every gesture, a calculated part of her husband's political ambition. But behind the closed doors of their Georgetown mansion, that smile faded, leaving a woman as cold and beautiful as the marble statues in the foyer, trapped in a gilded cage of profound loneliness. And he was Liam O'Connell, the new head butler. He was a man built of quiet efficiency and watchful eyes, moving through the grand rooms like a shadow. He was meant to be invisible, a functioning part of the household machinery, there to serve, not to see. Yet, he saw everything. He saw the flicker of despair in her eyes when the senator canceled dinner for the third time in a week. He saw the slight tremble in her hand as she poured herself another glass of wine in the dead of night. In the oppressive silence of the Vance estate, where every conversation was a performance and every emotion was suppressed, two lonely souls began to notice each other, not as a lady and her servant, but simply as a man and a woman, drawn together by a dangerous, unspoken understanding. Liam O'Connell's first day at the Vance estate began with silence. The heavy wrought iron gates, adorned with a golden V, had swung open without a sound, as if oiled by money itself. As he drove his modest car up the winding, perfectly manicured driveway, the house revealed itself, not all at once, but in elegant, imposing sections through the ancient oak trees. It wasn't just a house, it was a statement of power, a fortress of limestone and glass that seemed to absorb the light of the Washington, D.C. morning rather than reflect it. He parked in the designated staff area, a world away from the grand entrance, and was met by a woman named Mrs. Gable, the head housekeeper. She was a stern, thin-lipped woman whose posture was as rigid as her tightly pinned gray hair. Her tour of the home was less of a welcome and more of a military briefing. She spoke in hushed, reverent tones, pointing out the Ming vase in the entryway, the 17th century tapestries in the hall, the precise angle at which the silver cutlery must be set. The house was immaculate, a sterile cathedral of wealth where every surface gleamed under the recessed lighting. His footsteps, even in soft-soled shoes, seemed to echo too loudly in the cavernous halls. There was no clutter, no sign of life, no misplaced paper or comfortable chair. It felt less like a home, and more like the final, perfect photograph in an architectural magazine, a place where people existed only to maintain its perfection. Liam, who had worked in his fair share of wealthy homes, had never felt such a profound and chilling emptiness. It was the silence of a place where nothing important was ever said aloud. He first saw her in the grand salon, a room so large it could have hosted a state dinner. He heard her voice before he saw her form, a sound that was clear, melodic, and perfectly modulated, yet carried no discernible warmth. She was speaking to a florist about the week's arrangements, her words precise, her instructions exacting. And then he saw her, Eleanor Vance was even more beautiful than the society pages suggested. She was tall and slender, with a grace that seemed both natural and painstakingly rehearsed. Her blonde hair was swept back into an elegant chignon, not a single strand out of place. She wore a simple but obviously expensive cream-colored cashmere dress that fell just below her knees, her only jewelry, a pair of pearl earrings and the heavy diamond ring on her left hand. She stood with the unwavering poise of a ballerina, a portrait of aristocratic perfection. Mrs. Gable cleared her throat softly, and Eleanor's head turned. For a moment, her eyes, a startling shade of blue, met Liam's. It was then that he saw it, the first crack in the flawless facade. Her eyes held a deep, swimming sadness, a weariness that her polite, practiced smile could not quite conceal. It was a look he recognized, the look of a person playing a part they had long grown tired of. "Mrs. Vance," the housekeeper said formally. "This is Mr. O'Connell, the new head butler." Eleanor's smile tightened, becoming a perfect, impersonal curve. "Welcome, Mr. O'Connell," she said, her gaze sweeping over him for no more than a second. It was a glance that took in his uniform, his posture, his suitability for the role, but not the man himself. To her, in that moment, he was a new piece of furniture, a necessary component to ensure the smooth operation of her world. "Mrs. Gable has your list of duties. I trust you will be a valuable addition to our staff. If you require anything, please direct your questions to her." She turned her attention back to the florist, the brief interaction over, her dismissal as polite as it was absolute. Liam simply nodded, murmuring a "thank you, ma'am," to her retreating back. He understood his place immediately. He was there to be a ghost, a silent pair of hands, his presence required but his personhood irrelevant. That was the contract, and he was prepared to honor it. Throughout the rest of his first day, Liam moved through the house, learning its rhythms and its secrets. He learned that the senator was in Brussels for the week. He learned that Mrs. Vance took her tea at precisely 4 o'clock in the solarium alone. He learned which stairs creaked, which doors needed a gentle touch to close silently, and all the while, he observed her. He was a natural observer, a skill honed by a life spent on the periphery. From a distance, he saw her float through the impossibly large rooms, a solitary figure in a vast, empty landscape. He watched her arrange the new flowers the florist had delivered, her movements graceful but mechanical, her face betraying no pleasure in the beauty she was creating. Later, he was polishing silver in the dining room when he heard her on the phone in the adjacent study. Her voice, usually so controlled, was tight with a frustration she was trying to suppress. "No, Marcus, I understand," she said, a clear edge to her tone. "Of course, your work is important. No, it's fine. It's perfectly fine." There was a long pause, and then the soft, final click of the receiver being placed back in its cradle. A moment later, she walked past the dining room entryway, and he caught a glimpse of her face in the gilded mirror on the wall. The mask was gone. In its place was a look of such profound resignation, such aching loneliness, that it struck him with an unexpected force. As the long day bled into a quiet evening, Liam settled into his modest but comfortable quarters in the staff wing. The contrast between the cold opulence of the main house and the simple utility of his own room was stark. He sat on the edge of his bed, the list of his duties lying on the nightstand, and thought about the woman who drifted through those silent halls. He had come here for a job, for the stability and anonymity it provided. He had expected the demanding schedules, the high standards, the impersonal nature of service in a world like this. What he had not expected was her. He hadn't expected to feel a flicker of anything for the lady of the house, least of all a strange and unwelcome sense of empathy. He saw beyond the pearls and the cashmere, beyond the perfect hostess and the senator's wife. He saw a woman who was just as much a servant to the house in the name as he was, only her cage was far more beautiful, and its bars far more unbreakable. As he turned off the light, the image of her sad, blue eyes remained burned into his mind. He was the silent observer, and on his very first day, he had already seen the most important secret the house held. Its heart was breaking. The first few weeks of Liam's employment passed in a blur of silent, meticulous routine. He learned the geography of the vast house, the preferences of its absent master, and the subtle, sad rhythms of its lonely mistress. He became a master of invisibility, his presence a quiet hum in the background of the estate's life. But while he was invisible, His eyes were not. He continued his study of Eleanor Vance, and the more he watched, the more cracks he saw in her perfect porcelain facade. He learned to read the weather of her moods. A phone call from the senator's office would be followed by an afternoon of strained, brittle silence, where she would move through the rooms like a ghost, her hands clasped so tightly, her knuckles turned white. An evening gala, for which she would spend hours being sculpted into a vision of public perfection, would always end with her returning home, the light in her eyes extinguished, shedding her designer gown for a simple silk robe and a heavy glass of brandy. He noticed she rarely ate a full meal, instead picking at her food with a polite disinterest that spoke of a deeper hunger that no chef could satisfy. He saw her spend hours in the magnificent two-story library, not reading but simply staring out the tall windows at a world she could see but not touch. These were not the actions of a happy woman or even a content one. They were the survival mechanisms of a beautiful prisoner pacing the limits of her cage. One rainy Tuesday afternoon, the illusion of her composure shattered completely. Liam was in the main hall, carefully polishing a large silver mirror, a task that required quiet concentration. The door to the senator's study, which Eleanor used as her personal office when he was away, was slightly ajar. He could hear the low murmur of her voice as she spoke on the phone. He wasn't trying to eavesdrop, but the acoustics of the marble hall carried sound with unforgiving clarity. He couldn't make out the words, only the rising tension in her tone, the way it went from a placating softness to a thin, pleading note. There was a long, terrible silence, and then a sound that was sharper than a word, a small, choked gasp of pain. A moment later, the phone was slammed down onto its cradle, with a clatter that echoed through the hall. Liam froze, his hand hovering over the silver. He remained perfectly still as she emerged from the study, her face a pale, rigid mask. She walked directly to the floor to ceiling windows at the far end of the hall that overlooked the rain-drenched gardens. She stood with her back to him, her arms wrapped around her waist as if holding herself together. He wanted to retreat, to melt back into the shadows and afford her the privacy she so clearly craved. But he was trapped, unable to move without revealing his presence. And so, he watched her reflection in the mirror he was polishing. He saw her elegant shoulders begin to tremble, then shake with the force of silent, racking sobs. She didn't make a sound, a lifetime of practice, having taught her how to cry without being heard. The sight of this proud, beautiful woman breaking apart in such utter silence was more devastating than any scream. An instinct he didn't know he possessed, a fierce, protective urge, rose in his chest, a desperate need to go to her, to offer some small comfort. But he crushed it down. He was the butler. His job was to polish the silver, not to mend a broken heart. The boundary between them, however, was destined to be broken. It happened late one night, almost a month into his tenure. The senator had called, not to say he was coming home, but to inform Eleanor he was extending his trip through the weekend to attend a fundraiser in California. Liam, who had taken the call before passing it to her, had heard the manufactured warmth in the senator's voice and the chilling indifference beneath it. He was doing his final security check for the night, his soft footsteps the only sound in the sleeping house. As he passed the drawing room, he saw a soft glow from the fireplace and smelled the sharp, sweet scent of old brandy. He looked inside and saw her. She was curled on a sofa, a delicate crystal snifter in her hand, staring into the dying embers of the fire. She looked impossibly small and fragile in the cavernous room. He was about to retreat when it happened. Her hand, which was resting on the arm of the sofa, went limp. The heavy crystal snifter slipped from her numb fingers, falling to the marble hearth with a sound that was like a gunshot in the profound quiet. It exploded into 1,000 glittering shards. Eleanor didn't flinch. She didn't gasp. She just stared at the wreckage, at the pool of amber liquid spreading across the white stone, a single tear tracing a silent path down her cheek. It wasn't a look of shock or anger, but of utter soul-deep weariness. It was the look of a person who had just witnessed one more beautiful thing in her life break. Liam stepped into the room. "Mrs. Vance?" he said, his voice soft. She started, pulling her robe tighter around herself, her face instantly hardening back into the familiar mask of composure as she wiped her cheek. "It's nothing, Liam," she said, her voice strained. "I'm fine, just leave it. The morning staff can take care of it." He saw her bare feet were only inches from the scattered glass. "Please, ma'am," he insisted gently, "allow me." Without waiting for another protest, he went to the service closet and returned with a dustpan, a brush, and a damp cloth. He knelt on the hearth, his back to her, and began to meticulously sweep up the larger pieces of glass, his movements calm and efficient. He worked in silence, sensing that words were not what was needed. The only sounds were the soft scrape of the brush against the marble and the crackle of the last embers in the grate. His quiet, capable presence seemed to suck the tension out of the room. He wasn't judging her or fussing over her. He was simply and calmly fixing what was broken. When he had gathered every last glittering splinter, he wiped the hearth clean, leaving it pristine. He stood up and turned to face her. She was watching him, her expression unreadable. And then he crossed the line. He looked directly into her eyes, bypassing the mistress-servant dynamic completely, and asked the simplest of questions. "Are you all right, Eleanor?" He hadn't even realized he'd used her first name until the word was already hanging in the air between them. Her breath hitched. No one had asked her that question, with that tone of genuine concern, in years. She stared at him, truly seeing him for the first time. Not the uniform, not the butler, but the man. A man with kind, steady eyes and a quiet strength. She began, but her voice failed her. He gave a small, understanding nod. "Let me get you a glass of water," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. He returned a moment later, handing the glass to her. Their fingers brushed for a fraction of a second, a spark of warmth in the cold room. "Thank you, Liam," she whispered, her voice barely audible. As he turned to leave, she said his name again, softer this time. He paused at the door and looked back. Their eyes held for a long moment, a silent, profound communication passing between them. In that moment, the foundation of their world shifted. The wall between them had not just been cracked, it had been breached. And both of them, in the quiet solitude of that night, knew that nothing would ever be the same again. The night of the broken glass changed the atmosphere in the Vance mansion. A silent understanding now flowed between the lady of the house and her butler, a current of shared vulnerability that hummed just beneath the surface of their formal interactions. On the surface, nothing was different. He still addressed her as Mrs. Vance, his tone perfectly respectful. She still gave him instructions with a polite, aristocratic calm. But the space between them was now charged. Their glances would meet and hold for a fraction of a second too long across a polished dining table. When he handed her a letter on a silver tray, their fingers would brush, sending a jolt through them both that was as startling as it was unspoken. Liam found his duties now seemed to conspire to place him in her orbit. The silver needed polishing in the room where she was reading. The curtains needed adjusting in the hall she was about to walk down. He was no longer just an observer. He was a moth, circling a flame that was as beautiful as it was dangerous, knowing he was drawing perilously closer to being burned. His fascination with her began to transform, deepening into something more primal, a quiet, aching desire. He started to see her not just as one woman, but as two. The first was the public Eleanor, a creature of breathtaking, untouchable beauty. One evening, he was tasked with waiting in the foyer to assist her as she left for a political fundraiser. When she descended the grand staircase, the sight of her nearly stole his breath. She wore a gown of deep sapphire silk that was cut daringly low in the back, revealing the elegant line of her spine and the smooth, pale skin of her shoulders. Diamonds glittered at her throat and ears, catching the light of the chandelier. Her blonde hair was styled in intricate waves, and her lips were painted a bold, defiant red. As he held her velvet wrap for her, his knuckles brushed against the warm skin of her back. The contact was brief, electric, and utterly forbidden. He was hit with the intoxicating scent of her perfume, a complex fragrance of jasmine and something darker, more mysterious. In that moment, she was the epitome of wealth and power, a goddess descending from Olympus. But even then, he saw the faint, telltale tension in her jaw, the slight tremor in her hand as she gathered her clutch. This magnificent display was her armor, and the sight of it only made him wonder with a desperate, consuming curiosity what she looked like without it. The second Eleanor, the one who truly captivated him, would appear late at night, long after the armor had been cast aside. Sometimes, unable to sleep, Liam would do a quiet, final walkthrough of the ground floor. It was on these nights he would sometimes see her. She would be a solitary figure, wandering the dark, silent rooms in a simple robe of pale, clinging satin or silk. Her hair would be unbound, falling in a soft, golden cascade around her shoulders. Her face would be free of makeup, revealing a more delicate, fragile beauty. It was in these moments that Liam's imagination became his tormentor. He would watch from the shadows as she stood by the window, the moonlight tracing the soft curve of her hip, the elegant line of her calf, the gentle swell of her breasts beneath the thin fabric. He saw not the formidable Mrs. Vance, but Eleanor, a woman adrift in loneliness. The desire he felt then was a different creature entirely. It was not the awestruck admiration he felt for the goddess in the ball gown, but a deep, protective, and profoundly physical longing for the vulnerable woman in the moonlight. He would go back to his room, his heart pounding, his body aching with a forbidden need, imagining the feel of that silk beneath his hands, the taste of those lips without their defiant red paint, the sound of her whispering his name, not as her butler, but as her lover. Eleanor, for her part, found herself caught in a similar, bewildering tide of awareness. Her world, once so predictably empty, was now punctuated by the quiet, grounding presence of her butler. She began to look for him, her eyes scanning a room for his dark uniform when she entered. His presence became a strange source of comfort. He was predictable, reliable, and calm in a life that felt increasingly chaotic and performative. Then, she started to notice him. She noticed the way his simple black jacket stretched across a pair of surprisingly broad shoulders. She noticed his hands as he decanted wine or set a table, large, capable hands with long fingers that moved with an economy and grace that belied his strength. Most of all, she noticed the way he looked at her. Other staff members looked through her, their gazes polite and deferential, but Liam's eyes, when he thought she wasn't watching, held a quiet, burning intensity that seemed to see past the senator's wife and directly into the heart of the woman she was. It was a look of profound, unnerving recognition, and it made her feel a thrill that was equal parts fear and exhilaration. One afternoon, she was on a perfunctory phone call with Marcus. He wasn't even pretending to listen to her, instead rattling off instructions for an upcoming dinner party, his tone impatient. "And for God's sake, Eleanor," he'd said with a sigh, "try not to wear that green dress again. The party chairman's wife has the same one. We need to project originality." It was a small cruelty, but it was one of 1,000 that had worn her down over the years. Hanging up, her face burning with humiliation, she walked out of the study and nearly collided with Liam, who was carrying a tray of fresh linens. "My apologies, Mrs. Vance," he said, stepping back instantly. He looked at her, and his dark eyes softened with an immediate, intuitive understanding. He had likely overheard, and his expression contained no pity, only a quiet, shared indignation on her behalf. In that brief, silent exchange, she felt more defended and cared for than she had in a decade of marriage. The contrast was a physical blow, leaving her breathless and solidifying a dangerous, unspoken alliance in her heart. His quiet respect was becoming more seductive than any jewel or compliment her husband had ever offered. The storm broke over Washington just after 10 o'clock, a violent theatrical onslaught of wind and rain that rattled the antique windows of the Vance mansion. Each crack of thunder seemed to shake the great house to its foundations, and the gardens outside were lost in a churning, windswept darkness. For Eleanor, the storm was a fitting soundtrack to the tempest in her own soul. She sat in the cavernous drawing room, the book in her lap forgotten, a half-empty glass of deep, red wine in her hand. An hour earlier, Marcus had called. His voice, tinny and distant from his private jet, had been brisk, cheerful, and utterly devoid of empathy. He wasn't coming home. A last-minute opportunity, a meeting with a key donor in Palm Beach, had come up. He'd be back Sunday. Maybe. "You understand, darling," he had said, a statement, not a question, and she had murmured her assent, as she always did, before hanging up and feeling the familiar, suffocating weight of the silence rush back in to fill the space his voice had occupied. Tonight, however, the silence felt different. It felt heavier, more menacing. The storm outside had sealed her inside her gilded cage, and for the first time in a long time, She felt a frantic, desperate need to escape. The rich fabrics and priceless art that surrounded her felt like the opulent trappings of a tomb. Restless, she stood and began to wander, her silk robe whispering against the cold marble floors. She moved through the dark sleeping house, a ghost in her own life, the wine glass still in her hand. The drawing room, the grand salon, the formal dining room, all of them were spaces for a life she was supposed to be living, a performance for an audience that was never there. She felt an irrational pull towards the one part of the house that felt real, a place of work and substance. Following a sliver of light that escaped from under a service door, she found herself pushing it open and stepping into the kitchens. The change in atmosphere was immediate. The air here smelled of baking bread and dried herbs, not lemon polish and stale potpourri. The vast, stainless steel room was dimly lit, but gleaming and orderly. And there, at a large butcher block island in the center of the room, was Liam. He was in his shirt sleeves. His formal black uniform jacket hung neatly on a nearby hook. With his tie loosened and his sleeves rolled up to his forearms, he looked less like an automaton of service and more like a man. He was meticulously cleaning a set of antique silver candlesticks, his brow furrowed in concentration. He looked up as she entered, and a look of surprise, quickly masked, crossed his face. "Mrs. Vance," he said, his voice low, immediately straightening up. "Is everything all right? Can I get you something?" "I couldn't sleep," she said, the excuse sounding flimsy even to her own ears. The storm. She drifted further into the room, feeling like an intruder in this functional, honest space. "I thought perhaps a glass of milk." It was a lie, but it was an anchor in a sea of awkwardness. Liam simply nodded, his expression unreadable. Of course. He moved to the large refrigerator, his motions fluid and economical. As he poured the milk into a glass, his quiet competence filled the room. He wasn't flustered by her presence, he simply adapted to it. He placed the glass on the island in front of her. "I could make you a sandwich if you like," he offered. "There's some leftover roast chicken." She shook her head, but she didn't leave. She leaned against the cool steel of the counter, taking a small, perfunctory sip of the milk. The silence stretched, filled only by the drumming of the rain against the windows. "You work very late, Liam," she said, her voice softer than she intended. He shrugged, picking up his polishing cloth again. "There's always something to be done. It helps the time pass." His simple, honest answer seemed to unlock something in her. The carefully constructed walls she lived behind, already weakened by loneliness and wine, began to crumble. "I used to love storms," she said suddenly, her voice wistful, talking more to herself than to him. "When I was in college, I spent a semester in Florence. My apartment had a tiny balcony that overlooked the rooftops. I would sit out there when it rained, with a blanket and a cup of tea, and just watch the sky. It felt real." Liam stopped polishing. He turned to face her fully, leaning against the island and giving her his complete, undivided attention. The simple act of being truly listened to was so foreign to her that she felt a lump form in her throat. Encouraged by his silent focus, she continued, the words spilling out in a quiet, regretful stream. "I was studying art history. I was going to be a curator. I wanted to spend my life in dusty museums, surrounded by beautiful things with stories. I was fluent in Italian. I could tell you the entire history of a single piece of Renaissance pottery." She gave a short, bitter laugh. "Now I live in a museum, but the stories are all silent, and my Italian is all but gone." She looked down at her hands, at the ridiculously large diamond that symbolized the life she had chosen, or rather, the life that had been chosen for her. "It's funny what you trade away," she whispered, without ever realizing you're making a deal. She finally risked a glance at him, half expecting to see boredom or pity in his eyes. Instead, she saw only a deep, profound empathy. He didn't offer empty platitudes or tell her she had a wonderful life. He just held her gaze, his own eyes dark with an understanding that went beyond words. After a long moment, he spoke, his voice a low, steady rumble that was a comforting counterpoint to the storm. "I can see you there," he said softly, "on a balcony in Florence. It sounds like a beautiful life." He didn't say it was a beautiful life, or that she could have had a beautiful life. He said he could see her there in that moment, validating the existence of the young woman she had been, the woman she still was, buried deep inside. His simple words were a gift, a recognition of her true self, the self no one else in her current life ever bothered to look for. The air in the kitchen grew thick with a new kind of intimacy, one forged not of desire but of shared humanity. The storm outside began to quiet, its fury spent, leaving behind a soft, steady drumming of rain. The conversation lulled, and a comfortable, warm silence settled between them. "Thank you for listening, Liam," she said, her voice thick with unshed tears. He simply gave her a small, solemn nod. She turned and walked to the door, her bare feet silent on the tile. She paused at the threshold and looked back at him. He was still watching her, his expression intense and unwavering. In that look, the final boundary between them evaporated into mist. He was not her butler, and she was not his employer. They were a man and a woman who had just shared a secret more intimate than a touch. The emotional affair had begun, not with a bang, but with a quiet conversation in a storm, a whispered confession of a dream that had been lost, and the profound, dangerous comfort of finally being seen. In the days that followed their late-night conversation in the kitchen, the very air in the Vance mansion seemed to grow heavy, thick with unspoken thoughts and simmering tension. An invisible line had been crossed, and both Eleanor and Liam felt the profound, unsettling consequences. They began a strange and silent dance of avoidance. Liam, who had once found reasons to be near her, now charted his course through the house with the strategic precision of a soldier avoiding a minefield. He would take the long way through the service corridors to avoid the main hall if he knew she was there. He memorized her scheduled tea in the solarium, reading in the library, calls in the study, and made sure his duties kept him on a different floor, in a different wing. Eleanor, in turn, retreated behind her wall of formal authority. She began leaving her instructions for him in typed notes on Mrs. Gable's desk. Their direct interactions became brief, clipped, and excruciatingly professional. But their attempts to rebuild the boundary only served to make them more acutely aware of each other. The vast house suddenly felt small, and their accidental encounters were fraught with an electric charge that was nearly unbearable. A chance meeting in a hallway would cause them both to freeze, their eyes locking for a searing moment before they would murmur polite, meaningless apologies and hurry past, their hearts hammering against their ribs. The silence between them was no longer a space of quiet understanding. It was a vacuum, filled with the dangerous, volatile pressure of their shared secret and unspoken desire. The breaking point arrived on a deceptively beautiful Thursday afternoon. The sun streamed into the solarium, illuminating the dust motes, dancing in the air and warming the lush, exotic plants that filled the glass-walled room. Eleanor was on the phone with Marcus. He was supposed to be flying home that evening, and she had been allowing a small, fragile bud of hope to bloom in her chest. She had planned a special dinner, chosen a wine he loved. But the tone of his voice was wrong. It was the slick, overly charming tone he used with donors and journalists, not with his wife. Liam was just outside the solarium, tending to a collection of orchids, his movements slow and deliberate. He could not hear the senator's words, but he could see Eleanor through the glass, and he could hear the slow, painful destruction of her hope in the cadence of her voice. Her responses grew shorter, tighter. "I see," she said, her back ramrod straight. "But you promised, Marcus. You gave me your word." There was a pause. "An auction? For a boat? Is that truly more important?" Her voice cracked on the last word. Another, longer pause followed, and Liam watched as all the color drained from her face. She listened, her expression turning from hurt to disbelief, and then to a quiet, profound humiliation. "No," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "No, of course I'm not questioning your judgment. I'm sorry." She hung up the phone without another word, her hand remaining on the receiver as if frozen there. She sat perfectly still for a full minute, a statue carved from ice, and then, with a choked, guttural sob, she bolted from the room. She fled as if the house itself were on fire, pushing past a startled maid and shoving open the heavy French doors that led to the gardens. She didn't stop until she was deep inside the formal rose garden, a place of meticulously pruned bushes and perfect, scentless blooms, a place as beautiful and controlled as her own life. She collapsed onto a cold, unforgiving stone bench, all her carefully constructed composure shattered into a million pieces. The sobs she had held back for so long now tore through her violent, ragged gasps for air that felt as if they were ripping her apart from the inside. She was not just crying over a broken promise. She was crying for the wasted years, for the death of her dreams, for the crushing, absolute certainty that she was utterly and completely alone. From the solarium window, Liam watched her go. He saw her desperate flight and her subsequent collapse. His first instinct, the butler's instinct, was to remain invisible, to pretend he hadn't seen. But the man in him, the man who had listened to her stories in the dead of night, could not turn away. He saw the way she wrapped her arms around herself, shivering in the warm afternoon sun, a purely physical reaction to her emotional devastation. That was all the justification he needed. He turned from the window and walked swiftly to the hall closet, retrieving a soft, gray cashmere shawl, his excuse, his passport to cross the final, forbidden territory. He approached her quietly, his footsteps soft on the gravel path. "Mrs. Vance," he said, his voice just loud enough to be heard over her ragged weeping. She started violently, turning a tear-ravaged face to him, her eyes wide with panic and shame at being seen in such a state. "Go away," she choked out, turning from him and trying to hide her face. "Please, Liam, just leave me alone." Her plea was a raw, wounded sound, but he ignored it. He had spent weeks observing her pain from a distance, and he could not bear it for a second longer. He stepped around the bench to face her, his shadow falling over her. "You're shivering," he said simply, his voice a low, calming murmur. And before she could protest again, he leaned down and gently draped the soft, warm shawl over her trembling shoulders. His movements were slow, deliberate. As he settled the fabric, his fingers brushed against the bare, sensitive skin of her neck. The touch was like a lit match to dry tinder. An explosive shock arced through them both. Her sobbing stopped instantly, cut off by a sharp intake of breath. She looked up at him, her tear-filled blue eyes locked on his, her lips slightly parted. He didn't pull his hand away. He let it rest there, his thumb moving in a slow, instinctive circle against her skin, a gesture of pure, unadulterated comfort. She closed her eyes, leaning into his touch with a sigh that was a complete and total surrender. And it was this surrender that finally broke him. He lowered his head, and their lips met. It was not a kiss of tenderness or romance. It was a kiss of pure, desperate necessity. It was a collision, a frantic attempt to erase the cruelty of her husband's words, to fill the cavernous emptiness of her life. It was forceful and hungry, the taste of her salty tears mingling with a raw, undeniable passion that had been simmering for months. He held her head in his hands as if she were the most precious, fragile thing in the world, while his mouth claimed hers with a possessiveness that startled them both. For a heartbeat, she was still, and then, with a low moan deep in her throat, she answered him. She kissed him back with all the pent-up frustration, loneliness, and fury she possessed. Her hands came up, clutching the front of his simple white shirt, pulling him down to her, demanding more. It was a kiss that burned away everything, their roles, their duties, the house, the world, until nothing existed but the two of them, a man and a woman clinging to each other on a stone bench, as if drowning. They finally broke apart, gasping for breath, their foreheads resting against each other. The world rushed back in with a deafening roar, the buzzing of bees in the roses, the distant sound of traffic, the impossible reality of what they had just done. They stared at each other, their chests heaving, their eyes wide with a mixture of terror, exhilaration, and profound, irreversible change. The point of no return had been reached and crossed, not with a conscious decision, but with a sudden, explosive kiss that had sealed their fates together. The 2 days that followed the kiss in the rose garden were a unique and exquisite form of torture for them both. A new, irrevocable reality had been created, and they were forced to exist within its shimmering, dangerous confines. They continued their dance of avoidance, but it was no longer fueled by a desire to maintain propriety. It was now a desperate, terrified attempt to prevent the inevitable fire from consuming them completely. Every time they passed in a hallway, the air between them would crackle with a silent, deafening energy. Their eyes would meet, and in that fleeting instant, they would see the raw memory of the kiss, the taste of salt and desperation, the feel of clutching hands and yielding lips. The vast, silent mansion, once a symbol of their distance, now felt claustrophobically small, a pressure cooker tightening its lid with each passing hour. For Eleanor, the world had been knocked off its axis. Her routines, her duties, the very performance of being Mrs. Vance felt like a hollow charade. Her mind was filled with him. The image of his dark, intense eyes, the feel of his calloused hands on her skin, the memory of his mouth on hers, it was a constant, distracting, and intoxicating presence. She felt a frantic, humming energy under her skin, a mixture of profound guilt and a wild, exhilarating anticipation. She was terrified of what she had done, and even more terrified of how desperately she wanted to do it again. Liam, meanwhile, wore his professional demeanor like a suit of armor, but beneath it, he was in turmoil. The kiss had shattered his carefully constructed world of duty and observation. He was no longer a witness to her loneliness. He was a participant, a co-conspirator. The deep, empathetic concern he had felt for her had now fused with a raw, physical desire that was a constant low thrum in his blood. Every time he saw her, he had to physically restrain himself from reaching for her, from closing the agonizing distance between them. He performed his duties with his usual flawless precision, but his mind was elsewhere. When he served her tea, he remembered the taste of her tears. When he passed her in the hall, he could almost feel the silk of her blouse under his fingertips. He was acutely aware of the risk, of the catastrophic consequences that would follow if their secret was discovered. He could lose everything, his job, his reputation, his future. But even that knowledge, that cold, hard reality, was not enough to extinguish the fire the kiss had ignited. The memory of her passionate, desperate response was a brand on his soul, and he knew with a terrifying certainty that he was already lost. The breaking point came on the second night, a night so still and quiet you could hear the house breathe. The senator was not due back for 3 more days. The rest of the staff had retired to their quarters. The mansion was an island of silence in the Washington darkness. Eleanor was in her grand, opulent bedroom, a space she shared with a man who was more of a stranger to her than the butler. She had tried to read, but the words blurred on the page. She had tried to sleep, but her body was alight with a restless energy. She paced the length of the room, her bare feet whispering on the antique rug. She was at war with herself. The part of her that was Mrs. Vance, the sensible, respectable society wife, screamed at her to lock the door, to get into bed and forget the madness that had seized her. But the other part, the woman who had been awakened on a stone bench in the garden, the woman who was starved for a single, genuine touch, urged her to go, to find him. It was a battle she was destined to lose. With a soft, resigned sigh, she walked to her door, her hand hovering over the lock. She didn't turn it. Instead, she opened the door and stepped out into the dimly lit hallway. Liam was on his final rounds, a routine he performed on autopilot. His mind, however, was replaying the kiss in an endless, torturous loop. He told himself to finish his checks and go straight to his room, to lock his own door and stay there until morning. But his feet, seemingly with a will of their own, led him away from the staff wing and towards the main part of the house. He moved silently through the grand, sleeping rooms, drawn by an invisible thread, a desperate, unspoken hope. And then he saw her. She was standing in the cavernous archway of the library, the same room where he had first seen the depths of her unhappiness. She was bathed in a pale, ethereal column of moonlight slanting down from the tall Palladian windows. She was not in her nightgown, but was dressed in dark silk trousers and a simple, cream-colored blouse, as if she had been waiting. She was perfectly still, a phantom of beauty and longing in the darkness. He stopped at the far end of the hall, his heart seizing in his chest. They stared at each other across the vast expanse of polished marble, the silence between them so absolute it was like a physical presence. This was it, the final moment of choice. There would be no turning back from whatever happened next. The decision was hers to make, and he waited, his breath held in his throat. After an eternity that lasted only a few seconds, she slowly, deliberately, lifted her hand and beckoned him forward. Her voice, when it came, was a soft, trembling whisper that cut through the silence. Liam. It was all he needed. He crossed the distance between them, his footsteps unnaturally loud in the quiet hall. He stopped just before her, searching her eyes for any sign of doubt, any hint of hesitation. He found none. He saw only a reflection of his own desperate, aching need. This time when she moved, it was with a raw, undeniable purpose. She reached up, tangled her fingers in his hair, and pulled his mouth down to hers. The kiss was not frantic or desperate like the first one. It was deep, knowing, and impossibly hungry. A kiss of complete and utter surrender from them both. He backed her into the library, into the shadows, the scent of old paper and leather enveloping them. He pressed her against a towering bookshelf, his hands roaming her body, learning the curves and lines he had only ever imagined. With a low groan, he found the buttons of her silk blouse, his fingers fumbling with them in his haste. One of the small mother-of-pearl buttons popped and skittered across the floor, the sound echoing in the stillness. He didn't care. He pushed the fabric aside, revealing a bra of delicate, expensive cream-colored lace. The sight of such fragile finery, in the midst of their raw, burgeoning passion, was intoxicating. His rough, calloused hands that were used to polishing silver and carrying heavy trays, gently, reverently, cupped her breasts through the lace, and he felt her shudder against him. They sank to the floor, a tangle of limbs and whispered words on the rich, soft Persian rug. It was here, in the darkness, that the last vestiges of her resistance finally crumbled. As his mouth left hers to trace a fiery path down her throat, she whispered his name, a last, breathless protest. Liam, no, we shouldn't. But the words were a ghost of a thought, without conviction, without force. He answered not with words, but by kissing her again, a deep, silencing kiss that consumed her protest before it was even fully formed. And then, the no dissolved. It melted into a low, throaty moan of pure pleasure. She clung to him, her body arching against his, her voice breaking as she whispered his name again. But this time it was different. It was not a protest. It was a prayer, a plea, a complete and total capitulation. Liam, please. That first morning after, the world was both the same and irrevocably altered. The sun rose on schedule, the morning staff moved through the house with their usual quiet efficiency, and the scent of fresh coffee and floor polish filled the air. Yet for Eleanor and Liam, every familiar detail was now viewed through a new, sharply focused lens. When their eyes met across the vast expanse of the breakfast room, he standing at attention by the sideboard, she seated alone at the head of the long, empty table, the memory of what had happened on the library floor was a palpable, living thing between them. It was in the faint blush that rose on her cheeks, in the way his hand tightened for a fraction of a second on the silver coffee pot. There was a moment of sheer, cold panic for them both, a silent, mutual question of, what have we done? But beneath the fear was something else, something far more powerful, a deep, magnetic current that had now been fully unleashed. There was no discussion, no planning. Their affair began with the silent acknowledgement in that single, shared glance. It was a pact sealed not with words, but with the shared memory of transgression and the unspoken promise of more. Their life became a study in duality, a masterclass in secrecy, performed on the grand stage of the Vance mansion. They learned to communicate in a language of their own, a lexicon of subtle gestures and hidden signals. A copy of Leaves of Grass by Whitman, left on the library mantelpiece, was a question, a tentative hope for a meeting that night. The appearance of a single perfect white rose in the small vase in the main foyer was the answer, a quiet, breathless yes. Their days were a web of these stolen moments. He would be serving wine at a small luncheon. Eleanor was hosting, and as he leaned over her shoulder, his arm would brush against hers, a touch that lasted no more than a second, but sent a searing heat through her entire body, making her struggle to keep her composure as she spoke to the congresswoman beside her. She would walk past him in the hall, and her fingers would trail almost imperceptibly along the back of a chair he had just polished, a ghostly caress that he would feel long after she had gone. These fleeting, dangerous connections were the threads that wove their secret world together, a world that existed in the margins and shadows of their public lives. The constant risk of discovery only heightened the intoxicating thrill of their connection, making every stolen glance a defiant act of rebellion. Their bond, born from loneliness and ignited by passion, began to deepen into a powerful emotional dependency. For Eleanor, Liam became her anchor in a life of profound artifice. He was the only person before whom she did not have to perform. In their stolen hours together, she could shed the suffocating skin of Mrs. Vance and simply be Eleanor. She could laugh, a real, uninhibited sound he had never heard from her before. She could be silent without feeling the need to fill the space with polite chatter. She confessed her fears about Marcus's return, her frustrations with her empty life, and he would simply listen, his steady, non-judgmental presence a balm to her wounded soul. For Liam, Eleanor became the singular focus of his existence. The house and its duties were now merely the backdrop for their secret life. His purpose was no longer just to maintain the estate. It was to find ways to bring a flicker of genuine happiness to her eyes. He would leave a single perfect gardenia, her favorite flower, on her bedside table for her to find after a difficult phone call with her husband. He learned how she took her tea not from a sense of duty, but because he loved the small, pleased smile that touched her lips when he brought it to her, just the way she liked it. She was no longer a beautiful, tragic figure to be observed. She was the heart of his world, and he was consumed by a need to cherish and protect her. A few nights after their frantic, desperate coupling on the library floor, the signal was given. The Whitman novel appeared on the mantelpiece. The White Rose answered. This time, however, he did not find her in the library. Following a barely perceptible nod she had given him earlier in the evening, he made his way to the east wing of the house, to a guest suite that was so rarely used, it was kept in a state of permanent, dusty perfection. He opened the door without knocking and found her waiting for him. The room was lit by a single, small lamp, casting a soft, intimate glow on the rich damask wallpaper. She was standing by the window, not in a silk blouse, but in the thin, pale satin robe he had so often seen her in from afar. The sight of her, waiting for him, vulnerable and wanting, made his heart ache with a tenderness that was almost painful. He closed the door, the soft click of the lock sealing them in their private universe. He went to her, and this time, there was no frantic hunger in their first kiss. It was slow, deep, and searching, a kiss that spoke of emotion as much as desire. He led her to the large, canopied bed, and in the soft lamplight, he began to undress her with a slow, deliberate reverence that was a world away from their first frenzied encounter. He untied the silk sash of her robe and pushed it from her shoulders, letting it pool in a shimmering heap at her feet. His gaze roamed over her body, not with lust, but with a kind of awe. He traced the delicate line of her collarbone with his fingertip, his touch gentle, almost worshipful. His hands, so strong and capable, were now impossibly tender as they cupped her full, round breasts, which were as pale and perfect as sculpted marble in the dim light. "Eleanor," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion, "you are magnificent." A soft, shuddering sigh escaped her lips as his thumbs brushed over her nipples, making them harden instantly. She had spent a decade feeling like an object, a possession to be displayed, but under his adoring gaze, she felt beautiful. She felt seen. His hands slid from her breasts down to her narrow waist, then flared out to cup the gentle, womanly curve of her hips. He knelt before her, his lips tracing a path over her flat stomach, making her gasp. He turned her gently, his hands stroking the smooth, elegant line of her back and the full, soft swell of her buttocks. Every touch was a discovery, a worship. When he finally laid her back against the cool, crisp sheets of the bed, she pulled him down to her, her eyes shining with an emotion he had never seen in them before. "Liam," she whispered, her voice husky and full of a feeling that went far beyond mere physical need. In this quiet, hidden room, they were not the master's wife and the servant. They were simply a man and a woman, building a fragile, beautiful world for themselves, one stolen, tender moment at a time. For a short, blissful period, their secret world felt like the only real one. The vast, silent mansion transformed from Eleanor's prison into their private kingdom, a labyrinth of quiet corridors and shadowed rooms where they could steal moments of breathtaking intimacy. The fear that had initially plagued them receded into a golden haze of newfound passion and emotional discovery. They grew bolder, their secret language evolving, their stolen touches becoming more frequent. They learned the rhythms of the house and its staff, mastering the art of being in the same room, surrounded by people, yet entirely alone in their shared secret. For the first time in a decade, Eleanor felt truly alive, her laughter echoing in the hidden corners of the estate. For Liam, the weight of his duty was replaced by the singular, all-consuming purpose of loving her. It was a fragile, perfect bubble, but they both knew, in the logical parts of their minds they chose to ignore, that all bubbles are destined to burst. The first pinprick came in the form of a phone call. The senator was returning. His trip had been a resounding success, and he would be home in 4 days. He sounded jovial, triumphant, and possessive, rattling off a list of demands for his return, his favorite meal, a press briefing to be arranged, a celebratory dinner with his senior staff. For Eleanor, each word was a drumbeat of impending doom. The sound of her husband's voice, once just a source of lonely frustration, was now the sound of the executioner's footfalls approaching her cell. Suddenly, the house was no longer their kingdom. It was his. The clock began to tick with an agonizing slowness toward the moment their world would end. The golden haze dissolved, replaced by the cold, sharp-edged reality of their situation, guilt. An emotion Eleanor had successfully suppressed in the heat of her newfound happiness came rushing back in a sickening wave. She was not just a lonely woman finding comfort. She was an adulteress, the wife of a United States senator, playing a game so dangerous that the fallout would not just destroy her and Liam, but could very well cripple her husband's career. The fear took root in Eleanor and began to grow like a poisonous vine, twisting around every thought, every interaction. The house, their sanctuary, began to feel menacing, its familiar silence now filled with imagined whispers. Every creaking floorboard was a potential discovery. Every unexpected knock on her door sent a jolt of pure panic through her heart. She started watching the other staff, her mind racing with paranoid suspicions. Had Mrs. Gable's morning greeting been a little cooler than usual? Did the young maid who cleaned her room notice the scent of Liam's skin on her pillows? She would see him from across the grand hall, and the love and longing that usually filled her would be choked by a cold dread. He was no longer just her lover. He was her accomplice, and his presence was a constant, terrifying reminder of the crime she was committing. Her performance as the serene lady of the house became a Herculean effort. Her smiles felt brittle, her hands trembled as she poured tea, and her conversations were punctuated by moments where her mind would go blank, lost in a terrifying fantasy of Marcus walking in, his face a mask of cold fury. For Liam, the fear was a different, heavier burden. It was not just the fear of losing his job and his future, but the crushing weight of his responsibility to protect her. He had crossed a line from which there was no retreat, a profound betrayal of the professional code that had governed his entire adult life. But his guilt over that betrayal was eclipsed by his terror of what would happen to Eleanor if they were caught. He knew men like Senator Vance. He knew their pride, their cruelty, their capacity for cold, calculated revenge. The thought of Eleanor being at the mercy of that revenge was a physical pain, a constant knot of dread in his stomach. He became hyper-vigilant, a sentinel guarding their secret. He recalibrated their risks, insisting on more caution, longer intervals between their meetings. He, too, felt the eyes of the other staff on him, especially the shrewd, knowing gaze of Mrs. Gable. He knew that in a house built on secrets and hierarchies, the slightest disruption to the established order was noticed, filed away, and discussed in the hushed tones of the servants' quarters. The abstract fear became terrifyingly real in the cold, gray light of a Tuesday morning. They had spent a few precious, stolen hours together in the East Wing guest suite. A final, desperate meeting before the senator's return the next day. They had become careless, lulled into a false sense of security by the late hour and their all-consuming need for each other. Liam slipped out of the room just before dawn, while the house was still shrouded in a deep, pre-morning silence. He moved down the secondary service staircase, his steps silent, his mind still filled with the scent and feel of her. As he reached the bottom landing, a figure emerged from the shadows of the hallway, and he froze, his heart slamming against his ribs. It was Mrs. Gable. She was holding a small basket of cleaning supplies, her expression unreadable in the dim light. They stood there for a silent, agonizing moment. "Mr. O'Connell," she said, her voice quiet but sharp as glass. "You were up early." Liam's mind raced, scrambling for a plausible explanation. "Good morning, Mrs. Gable," he managed, his own voice sounding unnaturally calm. "I thought I heard a rattling from one of the windows in the East Gallery during the night. The storm from last week may have loosened a latch. I was just checking on it." The lie was thin, but it was the best he could do. Mrs. Gable did not move. Her sharp, intelligent eyes held his, and he could feel her weighing his words, searching for the truth. "A window latch," she repeated, her tone flat. "In this wing. I see." She gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, very diligent of you, and then she simply walked past him, her stiff posture and the sharp click of her sensible shoes on the floor a clear dismissal. She never looked back. He stood there, for a long time after she was gone, his back pressed against the cold wall, his body trembling with the aftermath of adrenaline. She hadn't accused him of anything. She hadn't raised her voice. But he knew with a certainty that chilled him to the bone that she was suspicious. He knew that their secret was no longer just their own. When he finally told Eleanor later that day, in a frantic, whispered conversation in the walk-in pantry, he saw the color drain from her face. The vague, shadowy fear that had been haunting her now had a name and a face. It was Mrs. Gable's cold, knowing stare. The walls of their gilded cage were closing in, and for the first time, Eleanor truly understood that it was no longer a question of if they would be caught, but when. The knowledge did not, however, extinguish their desire. It transformed it. That evening, their last before the senator's return, their passion was no longer tender or gentle. It was a fierce, desperate, almost violent clinging to one another in a small, dark storage closet, surrounded by the scent of cedar and mothballs. It was a frantic, wordless act of rebellion against the encroaching darkness. Their pleasure was sharp, edged with pain and fear, a final, defiant blaze before the inevitable end. They were no longer just lovers, they were fugitives. Stealing one last moment of life before the world they had built together was brought crashing down around them. The senator's return was like the lowering of a heavy velvet curtain, plunging the entire house into a state of formal, oppressive twilight. The moment Marcus Vance's black town car swept up the driveway, the atmosphere shifted. The air grew still and heavy, the staff moved with a new, nervous tension, and the brief, fragile illusion of freedom that Eleanor and Liam had cherished was instantly shattered. Senator Vance was a man who occupied space not just physically, but psychically. His booming voice, his self-important laughter, and his constant demanding presence filled every room, sucking the very oxygen from the air. He treated Eleanor with a benign neglect that was somehow more insulting than outright cruelty, patting her hand distractedly as he talked about his triumphs, complimenting her dress as if she were a piece of art he had acquired, but never once looking, truly looking, into her eyes. To him, she was the first lady of his own small kingdom, a beautiful, necessary prop for the grand theater of his life. For Eleanor, having to stand beside him, smile, and play the part of the adoring wife, while her heart and soul belonged to another man under the very same roof, was a torment beyond description. Their world shrank to a collection of unbearable, fleeting moments. They were now prisoners in the truest sense, constantly in each other's presence, but unable to speak, touch, or even exchange a meaningful glance. The longing, now combined with the constant, grinding fear of discovery, became a physical ache, a fever in the blood. Liam would stand at attention in the dining room, his face an impassive mask, while the senator recounted a boorish anecdote. He would watch Eleanor push food around her plate, her smile fixed and brittle, and the urge to storm across the room, to pull her from her chair and carry her away from this man and this life, was so powerful he had to grip the back of a chair to keep himself steady. Eleanor, in turn, would feel his presence in a room like a magnetic pull. She was so acutely aware of him that she could feel him watching her, even with her back turned. The sight of his capable hands pouring her husband's wine, or the sound of his quiet, respectful voice answering one of the senator's imperious demands, was a secret torture. They were two poles of a magnet, forced into proximity but held apart by an opposing, powerful force, and the energy between them grew more volatile, more explosive, with each passing day. The breaking point came a week after the senator's return, during a small, impromptu dinner party for some of his political allies. Eleanor had orchestrated the evening flawlessly, as was expected of her. But over dessert, Marcus, flush with expensive scotch and the sycophantic laughter of his guests, told a story about her early attempts at redecorating the house. He told it as an amusing anecdote, a tale of his charming wife's silly, extravagant tastes, which he of course had to gently but firmly correct. He patted her hand condescendingly as he finished. "She has a wonderful eye, of course, but she can get a bit carried away. It's a good thing she has me to manage the big picture." The table erupted in polite laughter. Eleanor felt the blood drain from her face. It was a public humiliation, a casual, brutal reminder of her status as a beautiful, brainless object in his world. She sat through the rest of the dinner, a perfect, smiling automaton. But inside, something had snapped. The careful, cautious fear she had been nursing for weeks was burned away by a sudden, white-hot rage. All she could think of was Liam's adoring gaze, his tender hands, the way he listened to her dreams as if they mattered. The contrast was so stark, so unbearable, that a wild, self-destructive recklessness took root in her heart. Later that night, long after the guests had departed, she lay in her grand, cold bed beside her sleeping husband. The sound of his slow, steady breathing was the rhythm of her imprisonment. She listened to it for what felt like hours, her rage solidifying into a desperate, defiant resolve. She would not be erased. She would not be a ghost in her own life. She would have one last act of rebellion, one final moment of feeling real, no matter the cost. Silently, she slipped out of the bed. She didn't go to the guest suite or the library. Instead, she went into her own private dressing room, a lavish, silk-lined space that connected directly to the master bedroom. It was the most dangerous place she could have chosen. With trembling hands, she took off her modest silk nightgown. From the back of a drawer, hidden beneath layers of cashmere, she pulled out a set of lingerie she had bought on a whim months ago and never dared to wear. It was made of black, intricate lace, a stark, scandalous contrast to the demure pastels Marcus preferred. It was a costume for a woman she was not allowed to be. Wearing it, she felt a terrifying, exhilarating surge of power. There was no book, no white rose. The signal tonight would be far more direct, far more dangerous. She walked to the hallway door of the dressing room, a door that was always locked at night, and she turned the key, leaving it slightly ajar. A silent, insane invitation into the very heart of the lion's den. Liam, lying awake in his own bed, tormented and restless, saw the sliver of light appear under the door on his final, silent patrol. He knew what it was. He knew what it meant. Every rational part of his brain screamed at him to turn around, to go back to his room and lock the door. But the image of her humiliated face at the dinner table, and the days of his own suppressed longing, had pushed him past the point of reason. He walked toward the light. He pushed the door open, and the sight of her took his breath away. She stood in the center of the room, clad in the forbidden black lace, a Valkyrie in the soft glow of a single lamp. The sound of the senator's breathing was a low, steady rumble from the adjacent bedroom, a constant, terrifying reminder of the man who lay sleeping not 20 feet away. Liam closed the door behind him, the soft click of the latch sounding as loud as a gunshot in the silent house. They didn't speak. They simply moved toward each other, their bodies driven by a force beyond their control. His hands worshipped the curve of her waist, the feel of the cool lace against her warm skin. Her fingers dug into his shoulders, her body trembling with a mixture of terror and desire. It was madness, it was suicide, and it was the most intensely alive either of them had ever felt. Their movements were frantic but almost completely silent, a desperate choreography of suppressed passion. Every touch was electric, every kiss stolen and breathless. He pressed her against a chaise lounge, his body covering hers, muffling the sounds she was so desperately trying to hold back. And it was then, in the throes of their reckless passion, that the proximity of the danger became an unbearable, intoxicating part of the act itself. Through the wall, they heard the sound of Marcus coughing in his sleep, the rustle of sheets as he turned over. They both froze, their bodies rigid, their eyes wide with terror. In the dead silence that followed, Eleanor's breath hitched in a sob that was half fear, half ecstasy. "Liam, my God," she whispered, her voice trembling against his ear. "He's right there. He could wake up. He could hear us." Her words, meant to be a warning, were instead the ultimate aphrodisiac. The sheer, insane risk of it all pushed them over the edge. He answered her not with words, but by kissing her again, a deep, possessive kiss that said he knew, and he didn't care. The terror in her eyes melted away, replaced by a glittering, defiant fire. She clung to him, her earlier fear transforming into a pure, concentrated need. "I don't care," she breathed against his lips, her voice a raw, desperate command. "Don't stop. I need this. I need you. And in the shadow of her husband's bedroom, they found a frantic, silent release, a shared, shuddering climax that was not just an act of passion, but an act of ultimate defiance, a fleeting, triumphant victory over the man sleeping soundly on the other side of the wall, oblivious to the ruins of the world he thought he controlled. The intoxicating high of their reckless defiance carried them through the next day on a wave of adrenaline and a false, giddy sense of invincibility. They had danced on the very edge of the abyss and had not fallen. The shared, terrifying secret of that night in the dressing room forged a new, feverish bond between them. In the senator's presence, they were now masters of deception, their faces perfect masks of propriety, while their eyes would occasionally meet across a crowded room, sharing a fleeting, silent acknowledgement of their insane triumph. They had become so adept at their double lives that a dangerous complacency began to set in. They believed, in their folly, that they were untouchable. But in their haste, in the frantic, silent passion of that night, they had been careless. A single, tiny thread in the intricate tapestry of their deceit had come loose, and it was only a matter of time before the entire thing would unravel. When Eleanor had clutched at Liam's shirt, her fingers desperate, one of the small, brass cuff buttons from his formal uniform, a button embossed with the Vance family crest, had popped off, falling silently onto the thick carpet, where it rolled, unseen, into the shadows beneath the chaise lounge. Meanwhile, Senator Marcus Vance was no one's fool. He had not built a political empire on ignorance. His entire career was based on his ability to read people, to sense shifts in loyalty, to detect the subtle, telltale signs of deception, and he had sensed a profound shift in his own house. His wife, who for years had been a creature of predictable, placid melancholy, now had a new, unfamiliar light in her eyes. It was a glittering, defiant spark that he had not seen since the earliest days of their courtship, and its sudden reappearance now struck him as suspicious. She was jumpy, distracted, her smiles too bright, her laughter too quick. He noticed the way she avoided his touch, flinching almost imperceptibly when he placed a hand on her arm. He also noticed the butler. He saw the way the man's gaze would follow Eleanor when he thought no one was watching, the quiet, unnerving intensity in his eyes. The pieces were not yet connected, but they were spread out on the board, waiting for a final, clarifying move. His suspicions were quietly stoked by Mrs. Gable, who, in her weekly report on the household, had made a single cryptic comment. "Mr. O'Connell has been very diligent in his duties, Senator," she had said, her emphasis just slightly off, especially concerning the East Wing and Mrs. Vance's personal quarters. She said nothing more, but she didn't have to. The seed of a specific, ugly suspicion had been planted. Marcus did not confront. He did not accuse. He simply began to watch. The unraveling happened on a quiet Friday afternoon. The senator, who was supposed to be in meetings on Capitol Hill, had come home unexpectedly, claiming a sudden migraine. He had retreated to the master bedroom to rest, while Eleanor, unnerved by his presence, busied herself in her dressing room, tidying drawers that were already perfectly orderly. A fragile sense of calm had begun to settle over her. Marcus was home, yes, but he was sleeping. Liam was on the other side of the house. The danger felt distant again. As she was placing a pair of pearl earrings back in their velvet box, her hand slipped, and one of the earrings fell to the floor, bouncing on the carpet. With a sigh of irritation, she knelt to look for it. It had rolled under the ornate chaise lounge in the corner of the room. She got on her hands and knees, lifting the silk skirt of the lounge to peer into the shadows beneath. Her fingers found the smooth, cool pearl of the earring, but they also brushed against something else, something small, hard, and metallic. Frowning, she retrieved it. She brought it out into the light, her palm open. It was a small brass button, tarnished and dull. For a moment, she felt nothing but mild confusion. It wasn't hers. Then, she turned it over, and her blood ran cold. There, stamped into the metal, was the unmistakable shape of the Vance family crest. Her mind exploded. In an instant, she was back in that room, in the darkness, clinging to Liam, the feel of his starched white shirt under her desperate hands. She could almost hear the tiny, insignificant pop of the button giving way, A wave of nausea and pure, undiluted terror washed over her. Her first instinct was to get rid of it, to flush it, to throw it out the window. Her fingers closed around the tiny piece of evidence, her knuckles white. She had to find Liam, to warn him. Her mind was a frantic, screaming chaos. As she scrambled to her feet, the button clutched in her fist. And then she froze. He was standing in the open doorway that connected the dressing room to the bedroom. Marcus. He was not dressed for bed. He was in his suit trousers and a crisp white shirt, his tie loosened. He wasn't rubbing his temples or complaining of a migraine. His eyes were clear, sharp, and utterly devoid of warmth. And he was not looking at her face. He was looking at her clenched fist. He hadn't just woken up and walked in. The unnerving stillness about him told her he had been standing there for some time, watching her. "What have you found, my dear?" he asked, his voice eerily calm, almost pleasant. It was the most terrifying sound she had ever heard. "Nothing," she stammered, her heart hammering against her ribs so hard she thought it might break. "It's nothing. Just an old button I found." She tried to move past him, to escape the suffocating intensity of his gaze. He didn't raise his hand to stop her, but his voice did. "Show me." It wasn't a request. It was a quiet, absolute command. She stood rooted to the spot, shaking her head, the tiny object in her hand feeling as heavy and damning as a murder weapon. "Marcus, please," she whispered, her voice pleading. "It's nothing, I promise." He took a slow, deliberate step toward her. "Eleanor," he said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous whisper. "Do not make this more unpleasant than it needs to be. Open your hand." He reached out, and with a gentleness that was far more menacing than any violence, he took her wrist. He did not grab or squeeze. He simply applied a steady, unyielding pressure until her trembling fingers, one by one, were forced to uncurl. The brass button fell from her palm and into his. He picked it up and held it between his thumb and forefinger, examining it under the light. The silence in the room was absolute, broken only by Eleanor's ragged, shallow breaths. He looked at the crest. He looked at the frayed thread still caught in its shank. He knew exactly what it was. He knew exactly where it had come from. The final piece of the puzzle had just clicked into place. He didn't yell. He didn't rage. He didn't accuse her of infidelity. He simply looked up from the button, his eyes meeting hers. And then, a slow, terrible smile spread across his face. It was not a smile of amusement. It was a smile of pure, triumphant contempt. The smile of a predator that has finally, definitively trapped its prey. He had her. And he knew it. He let the button fall from his fingers, its soft clink on the hardwood floor, the sound of a guillotine blade dropping. "The butler," he said, his voice a soft, wondering murmur, laced with a cold, devastating disgust. "Liam O'Connell. Really, Eleanor?" He shook his head slowly, the cruel smile never leaving his lips. "After all, I've given you this house, this life, and you choose something so predictable. So, common." He let the final word hang in the air, a deliberate, perfectly aimed arrow designed to pierce her pride and her heart. He then turned his back on her, straightened his tie, and walked calmly back into the bedroom, leaving her standing alone in the middle of her beautiful, luxurious dressing room. The curtain had not just fallen. It had been ripped down, and she was left exposed, shivering, and utterly, completely ruined, with the chilling realization that her punishment was not going to be a swift, passionate explosion, but a cold, slow, and masterfully orchestrated dismantling of her entire world. There was no screaming match, no thrown china, no tearful, dramatic confrontation. The aftermath of the discovery was as cold, quiet, and brutally efficient as a corporate takeover. That evening, Senator Vance summoned Liam to his study. The room, with its dark wood paneling and walls of leather-bound books, felt like a courtroom where the verdict had already been decided. The senator sat behind his large mahogany desk, the brass button placed neatly on the leather blotter in front of him, a single damning piece of evidence. He did not ask for an explanation or a confession. He simply slid a thick envelope across the desk. "This is your final payment," he said, his voice devoid of any emotion. "It is more than generous. In return, you will leave this house within the hour, and you will forget you ever worked here. you will forget my wife's name. If I ever hear that you have spoken of this to anyone, I will use the full weight of my office to ensure that the rest of your life is a series of unfortunate, unending complications. Do you understand me, Mr. O'Connell? Liam looked at the powerful, remorseless man before him, and then he looked past him at a framed photograph of Eleanor on the credenza, her smile bright and unknowing. He simply nodded, took the envelope, and walked out of the room without a word. He packed a single bag in his small staff quarters, walked out the back service gate, and never once looked back at the grand, imposing house that held the ruins of his heart. For Eleanor, the punishment was far more intricate, a life sentence to be served in the beautiful prison she had once called home. Marcus laid out the new terms of their marriage with the chilling precision of a lawyer reading a will. Her personal credit cards were canceled. Her private cell phone was replaced with a new one, monitored by his office. Her social engagements, once her own domain, were now to be vetted and approved by his chief of staff. She was a prisoner, and Mrs. Gable, with her ever-watchful, knowing eyes, was her warden. The most exquisite cruelty of her sentence was that the facade of their perfect marriage had to be maintained, now more rigorously than ever. She still had to dress in designer gowns and attend galas on her husband's arm. She still had to smile for the cameras, her hand resting in his, a perfect portrait of power and partnership. But now, when he smiled down at her, the look in his eyes was one of pure, triumphant ownership, the look of a man who has successfully broken a prized but unruly stallion. She was his greatest possession, and her public adoration was the ultimate symbol of his control. The loneliness she had felt before was a dull ache. What she felt now was a sharp, constant, living agony, the pain of a soul that had tasted freedom for a fleeting moment, only to have the door to its cage not just closed but welded shut forever. Years passed. The scandal never broke. Senator Vance's star continued to rise, his power and influence growing with each election cycle. The world moved on, as it always does, and the quiet, internal dramas of the Vance mansion were forgotten by all but the two people whose lives they had irrevocably shattered. Far away, in a fading industrial city in the Midwest, Liam O'Connell managed the night desk at a respectable but unremarkable hotel. He was older now, the quiet intensity in his eyes having softened into a permanent, weary sadness. He lived a life of deliberate anonymity, a ghost moving through the graveyard shift. He was polite, efficient, and utterly forgettable, which was exactly the way he wanted it. No one knew that the hands that now checked in weary business travelers had once touched the silken skin of a senator's wife. No one knew that the man with the quiet, empty eyes had once been consumed by a love so fierce it had cost him everything. He had served his sentence in a prison of obscurity, haunted by the phantom limb of a life he had briefly, impossibly lived. One night, during the deep, silent hours just before dawn, he was cleaning the hotel lobby, collecting the newspapers and magazines left behind by guests. He picked up a glossy, high society publication, its cover celebrating the power players of DC. He flipped through it idly, his mind numb with fatigue, until he turned a page and his heart stopped. There she was. It was a full-page photograph from some charity ball. The senator stood center stage, his hand raised in a confident wave, a man at the absolute peak of his power, and there, beside him, was Eleanor. She was, if anything, more beautiful than he remembered. A vision in emerald green, with diamonds sparkling at her throat. Her smile was a perfect, dazzling curve, her posture the epitome of grace. To the world, she was a woman who had everything, a figure of envy and admiration. But Liam didn't see the dress or the jewels. He looked past the flawless, public mask and into her eyes, and he saw it. The same profound, swimming sadness he had seen on his very first day, the same loneliness he had witnessed by a rain-streaked window. It was no longer a fleeting crack in the facade. It was now the foundation. It was the permanent truth of her, frozen in place for the whole world to see, yet visible only to him. He slowly closed the magazine, the slick, heavy paper cool against his skin. The silence of the empty lobby pressed in on him, and he was left with nothing but the low, fluorescent hum of the lights and the haunting, indelible image of her eyes, the final, silent testament to a forbidden love that had cost them both the world.